Hey everyone, it's Nathan with Crown & Caliber, and today we're going to be looking at reissue watches. Now, reissue is kind of a vague term. Some people will call them re-editions, sometimes you hear the term homage, and we think often this can get a bad rep. People hear that and they think, oh, it's just ripping off a design or it's trying to be a vintage watch. And there are plenty of examples out there that we don't think are done well. But we were perusing around and we found a number of watches here at Crown & Caliber that we think do this really well. And so what we want to do is we want to present them to you and hopefully give you an idea on what to look for if you're interested in kind of a vintage inspired watch or a reissue. So let's get started. So the watches we're going to be looking at today are 5 watches that kind of fit this definition of reissue. And loosely that means they are calling upon specific models from the brand's history or maybe just design elements of that particular model, and what comes out of it is a wholly new model. So what we're going to start off with is we're going to start off with the Zenith El Primero Chronomaster 38mm. Now this is probably one of the closest to its original model that it draws inspiration from, and that is the El Primero. Now the El Primero gains its name from the 1969 movement known as the El Primero, and it was one of the first automatic chronograph movements. Now this has become a movement that ends up in plenty of Zenith watches. What Zenith did is kind of with the times, they made this watch larger and they kept using the movement. Some of its more notable characteristics are the fact that its beat is at 36,000 beats per hour, which is higher than maybe the standard 28,800. So it has a much smoother sweep to its second hand, but it's a larger watch. It was a 42mm timepiece, and that doesn't work for everyone, especially with kind of the El Primero design. It has these kind of long angular lugs. And then recently, Zenith goes ahead and kind of pulls back and makes a El Primero Chronomaster in 38mm. So effectively the same size as the original El Primero from 1969. And it is awesome. It is like a new old stock Zenith El Primero. You still have that movement, the original El Primero movement, and you now have the original case size, that 38mm case size. Some of the things that it also does really well is it has some awesome pops of color. You get slates and grays, silvers, blues, and probably most notably is a red chronograph seconds hand with the El Primero Zenith star. It is just an awesome timepiece. It is a perfect example of a chronograph that has clearly stood the test of time, and props on Zenith for bringing back that original 38mm case size. It wears so well on the wrist. It's not trying to be anything than what it is. It is a moderately sized, automatic in-house chronograph movement that just works. Another great nuance about the Zenith El Primero Chronomaster 38mm is the dial. And I know I just mentioned how it has lots of pops of color, but it also comes in variations. So you can have an all blue dial, you can have a slate dial, you can even have a silver dial, and it's the combination of those 3 colors and their kind of interplay in the subdials that just makes this a wonderful watch to look at. I think another point that's really interesting, and this kind of speaks to this whole collection and why we pick some of these, is the proportions on this watch are just great. And it kind of shows that the original proportions worked. And some of that can sometimes be lost when modern watches in their larger case size are still using maybe older and smaller movements. So when you go back to that 38mm case size, the dial layout is just perfect and it just works. And then lastly, something that I think the new Chronomaster 38mm has that the original from 50 years ago doesn't is just a higher level of finish and attention to detail. Between high polished surfaces and brushed finishes, it definitely feels like a luxury timepiece. And I'm not saying the one from 1969 didn't, but you can definitely see how Zenith is making a piece that fits perfectly into a luxury watch collection or a perfect first watch if you are getting into luxury watches. So there you go, the Zenith El Primero Chronomaster 38mm. The next reissue that we want to highlight is the Omega Speedmaster First Omega in Space. Now, this is personally one of my favorite watches, let alone favorite reissues, and here's why. The watch that it is calling upon is the watch that Wally Schirra in 1962 wore into space. So, first Omega in space. October 3rd, 1962 to be more specific. And that watch was a pre-Moon Speedmaster, so it looks different than the traditional Speedmaster Professional that we think of today. And when Omega set out to create this kind of homage or reissue, as we're referring to it, they did so many things right. For starters, you get a 39.7 millimeter case. Now that is a good bit smaller than a traditional Speedmaster Professional, but it is almost millimeter for millimeter the same as the watch that Wally wore into space. So you have a slightly smaller case. Some other things that I think are perfect is the watch has straight lugs, so calling back to that original case that Wally Schirra wore. You also have no crown guards. So these are things that have become known for on the Speedmaster Professional, and on the first Omega in space they're gone, and they work so well. It makes for a slightly different version of a Speedmaster that definitely wears like it is a vintage watch. Some of the other features that are great are the sword style hands that were from the original watch, the applied Omega logo on the dial, and having that just pops. It looks good. It's something that you don't see often anymore, and again, it kind of gives that tug back to the vintage inspiration. So all of those elements call upon a design that, if you didn't know any better, you would just say is a wholly new design. But again, it is referencing the pre-Moon Speedmaster that Wally Schirra wore. Now, a few kind of, we'll say, modern tweaks to it are the use of the caliber 1861. This is a manual wound Omega caliber. It is what you would find in the standard Speedmaster Professional, and I think it was the perfect choice. Granted, you would want a caliber 321 of the original Omega Speedmaster that Wally Schirra wore, but that's not going to happen. So instead, what we get is we get the movement that would be in a modern day Speedmaster. And again, it is still a Lamania-based, Lamania architecture movement, and to me, it's great. It keeps the cost down, and it is a movement that works, and that's what you want. Another area where they decided to maybe deviate is it has a sapphire crystal. And there are going to be a lot of people that call foul because it's a Speedmaster with a sapphire crystal, but I think we can look at what Omega is doing here, and they're saying, hey, this watch is not going to space anymore. It's going to be on your wrist. You're going to wear it around, and you're going to bump it up into things, and we think that having a sapphire crystal is more practical than the hezolite that would have traditionally been on the watch. Another nice little nod, and really the only overt nod to Wally Schirra's watch, is on the case back. It is solid. It is printed with the classic Omega hippocampus and the date October 3rd, 1962, when the Sigma 7 launched into space, and that Omega became the first Omega in space. So there you go, guys. The Omega Speedmaster, first Omega in space. So next in our hidden gem reissue watches, we're going to be looking at the JLC Grand Reverso Ultra Thin Tribute to 1931. We're not going to call it that going forward because that is a mouthful, but this watch is amazing. So this is JLC's 80th anniversary of the Reverso when this is released. So 1931, Reverso comes out. It's an awesome watch. It is a way in which polo players can protect the crystal of their watch with a novel mechanism, and that has maintained for 90 years. On its 80th birthday, we get the tribute to 1931, and here's why this watch is great, for a few reasons. For starters, it is a little larger, so it's a more contemporary size. We're talking about a Reverso that is 27.5 millimeters by 46 millimeters, the latter measurement being lug to lug, and it is gonna wear well on pretty much any wrist. Even on my wrist, it's almost too big, but it works. It's a great watch. On top of that, it has an extremely clean dial. We're talking about a black dial that says Reverso. I mean, it is stark. It is Art Deco in the best of ways. I mean, they pulled that straight from the original design. Inside the tribute to 1931 is the JLC caliber 822. Now, this is a classic JLC hand-wound movement, and this does a really good job at keeping that watch ultra thin. This watch is right at 7 millimeters thick. So even though it is, like I said, pushing up to the larger size for a Reverso, it still wears so well on the wrist because of how thin it is. And the last point that we want to drill down on with the JLC tribute to 1931 is back on the dial, the luminescence. Now, this luminescence has a slight faux patina to it. And this is the only watch that we're looking at today that has any semblance of a faux tina, as we like to call it. And I think that a reason that all of these watches up here do such a great job in kind of that reissue category is they're not trying to be something that they aren't. These are modern day watches that draw on that inspiration. And this JLC does it so well because of how subtle it is. And on that stark dial, that Art Deco design, that subtle faux tina just fits. So there you go. The JLC Grand Reverso Ultra Thin Tribute to 1931. So number 4 in our reissue list is the TAG Heuer Carrera Reedition 1964. I love this watch. Obviously, I love all these watches up here. This watch is so great. In comparison to the Carrera from the 1960s, this one here that came out in the 1990s does so many things well. It is a 36mm case, so we have the same case size. It has those angular lugs from the original Carrera. The case back is austere. It's just brushed stainless steel. Looking at the dial design is almost identical to the original Carrera from the 1960s. The dial doesn't even say TAG Heuer on it, even though at this point the company is TAG Heuer. It just says Heuer. The pops of blue from the original dial are still there. Granted, there are some subtle differences, but to the untrained eye, you are looking at a new old stock Heuer Carrera from the 1960s. The crystal is still an acrylic crystal as well to play with that vintage aesthetic. And really the big difference between these two, other than an astronomical price difference, comes in the movements. The original Carrera has the Reissue caliber 72. That is an iconic column wheel chronograph movement that was in some of the original Daytonas as well. And here what we have is we have a Lamania 1873. Now this is a vertical clutch chronograph, so maybe not as desirable as that Reissue 72, but it's a solid movement. It allows for a manual wound chronograph, and it takes an iconic design and packages it in a much more affordable and easily attainable watch. So there you go, you have the TAG Heuer Carrera Reedition 1964. All right, guys, so rounding out our choice for really well executed reissue watches is the Rolex Milgauss. Now this one may surprise some of you, but this is a really good example, and here's why. So originally the Milgauss is from the 50s, 1954, 1956, some debate between the 6541 and the 6543, with the 6543 coming first as a prototype, but that doesn't matter. Here's what matters. We're looking at 1956, the Rolex Milgauss 6541 comes out. Now, upon first inspection, it almost looks like you're looking at a Submariner. It's a black dial sport watch with an oyster bracelet and a black rotating bezel. But if you start to look closer, things are different. There's a honeycomb dial, there's different hour markers, and there is a really unique seconds hand. There's a lightning bolt seconds hand. Yes, in 1956, there was a Rolex with a lightning bolt seconds hand. Now this watch, Milgauss, was designed to withstand high magnetic fields, and that was in part due to its inner iron cage that protected the movement. Now, there were some different iterations of the Milgauss in those years. There was the 1019, which did away with the rotating bezel and had just a smooth bezel. And eventually the lightning bolt seconds hand was gone as well. So fast forward to 2007, and we have the release of the Rolex Milgauss 116400. And boy, this was a doozy. So we have a 40mm stainless steel sport watch with a smooth bezel and an orange lightning bolt seconds hand. Yes, the Milgauss brought back that seconds hand, and it was orange. There was also orange accents on the dial. We're talking about a black dial watch, and a green tinted sapphire crystal. These are things that no one would have expected from Rolex, but you can see them putting together that Milgauss 6541 and the reference 1019 to create a wholly new, like we call it, a reissue watch. So you've got the smooth bezel, you've got this crazy lightning bolt seconds hand that is orange, pops of orange color on the dial, and to top it off, you have a green tinted sapphire crystal. And Rolex went on to claim that this was so hard to produce that they didn't even bother filing a patent because nobody else is gonna do it. And if that's not the most Rolex thing that you've heard of, I don't know what is. Also worth noting,
that's so cool.
That is the only modern Rolex that does not have a laser etched crystal or laser etched coronet because of the tinted green sapphire. So, little known fact. So there you go, you have the Rolex Milgauss 116400 coming out screaming in 2007. And not only does it have its inner iron cage, you now have a movement that actually has paramagnetic qualities in the hairspring. So definitely a far cry from some of the more traditional reissues that you see up here, but I think a really good job kind of reinvigorating a somewhat lost design in the Rolex catalog. So there you go, guys. There are 5 examples of what we think are really well executed, we like to call them hidden gem reissues. They maybe don't jump out on the page as the most prominent vintage inspired watch, but we think that's why they are so successful. So let us know in the comments below, guys, what you think about our choices on some hidden gem reissues. And let us know if there's some that we missed. Let us know if there is a better example of a watch that could fit up here. And as always, guys, thanks for watching.